reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah D'Souza, and Dr. David Proctor.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I'm going to.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Thread. We are in episode 29 of our series, God's Land Established. It's our penultimate episode, and we are in the book of Judges today.
This is definitely a podcast that's important to come back to the big picture. Context is so important for this story. It really helps us to see the why. You know, I always like to ask the question, why is this in the Bible, and what would happen if we didn't have it? What would we not know if we didn't have it? And Judges is definitely that kind of book. So we're going to put this image back up for those watching that we created for this whole series in the Old Testament. And as we look back at this chronology of this meta-narrative in the Old Testament, it's a lot easier to frame and see what's happening here when we look at this. So let's just do a brief review of the story up until now in a couple sentences or less. So Yahweh in Genesis creates everything, and he puts human beings with him in a garden to walk with him. We talked about that being the image of what God intends for us. And yet we find out very quickly that humans are determined to be independent. That really plays out quickly with devastation, that independence, with murder and wickedness. And I mean, Hannah, if you could read in Genesis 6, we read right, in the early chapters of the Torah, this verse in verse 5, Genesis 6:5.
Yahweh saw that the wickedness of humans was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually.
Yeah, so obviously things went sideways quickly. So Yahweh renews the earth with a flood. He chooses one man, Abraham, and his family to build a covenant with. And it's his grandson, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, or Israel, that becomes the patriarch of this family. He has 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes of Israel. The whole family moves to Egypt because there's a famine, and they end up enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. So it's, we've gone over all this, but this is all important background for this story. So Yahweh raises up Moses to partner with him in bringing Israel out of their slavery and into the wilderness, where he can form them and set out a way of life that will lead to abundance and fullness. And this way of life that he sets out for them, which we call the law, is bound in covenant. So the whole thing is shaped in this relationship commitment. And as we studied out and we looked at all these, books of the Bible that took place in the wilderness, Yahweh shapes their culture. He shapes them legally. He shapes them spiritually. And the whole intent is that they can thrive as a people, right? And once they seem ready, meaning they've grown in their healthy dependence on Yahweh, they're humble, they've established patterns and rhythms, they've got a priesthood, they've got the law, they've arranged the military, everything's ready to go, then they cross into this promised land. And while we may not fully understand this, and I think it's going to become more clear today, the why of this, Yahweh insists that Israel does not cohabitate with the Canaanites. They have to be driven out. And, when we look at these stories and we get really sometimes freaked out about, what's actually happening in these individual stories. And that's why it's so important that we step back and really look at this. So he tells them over and over again, when they first get to the wilderness, what's coming, but then he reiterates this in Deuteronomy right before they cross into the promised land, the importance of really not cohabitating with the Canaanites. And if you could read these 6 verses in Deuteronomy 7, this is really important to set up what's going to happen here in the book of Judges.
When Yahweh your God brings you into the land that you're about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, and when Yahweh your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for that would turn away your children from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of Yahweh would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But this is how you must deal with them. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred poles, and burn their idols with fire. For you are a people holy to Yahweh your God. Yahweh your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on earth to be his people, his treasured possession. I think having just done that episode with Dr. Burns on Joshua, it helps reading this, like passages like this now, in the context of the meta narrative that we've been talking about, and kind of the big picture, and to know that this was spoken by the same God that charged Abraham and Sarah to be a blessing to all nations back in Genesis 12. So it's not about favoritism, and it's not about God hating the Canaanites so much as what they represent. And they represent a way of life that God's people cannot partner with.
That's exactly right. Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, in fact, I mean, Yahweh, as you can see in this passage, hopes that Israel can be a light to the nations. That's the hope. He wants to establish a new way of living that will actually bring fullness. And so the reason he's called his people to be holy or set apart is so that they can become a model, as opposed to falling into the ways of the world around them and lose sight of what it really means to be holy and to have that life of fullness. So there's really, when we get into the book of Judges, there's really two major things happening. The first thing, which we'll unpack here for a while, is Israel didn't do this. They did not fully drive out the inhabitants of Canaan. And then Israel continued to be drawn into this culture of the Canaanites. And when things got ugly, then they cry out to Yahweh. And that leads to the second part of what the book of Judges is really about, which is because Yahweh is a covenantal God and he feels compassion and he's gracious, he steps in the middle of their mess and he tries to work through their leaders. He even, we read repetitively that there's this kind of extra boost that the Spirit of God comes upon these judges. But it's always short-lived in the sense that there's not thorough repentance deeply through the community. And so when the leader dies, the pattern repeats. And we read over and over again, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So that's what the book of Judges shows us. And it shows it to us not once or twice or three times, but over and over and over again. And we're going to see a pattern develop that gets further and further away from Yahweh and his hope for his people. So we need to start with part one of this problem. And that's really the first two chapters here in the book of Judges. So when we look at chapter 1, what we see is that Israel does not fully drive out the inhabitants of Canaan, like Yahweh says. And it's really important to understand the reason we're given. Right? Yahweh's concerned that by leaving the Canaanites in place, that the moral standards of Israel would drop to the Canaanites' moral corruption. He was also concerned that they would imitate the detestable worship practices that the Canaanites had developed, including child sacrifice. Now, what's going to be really sad is we see this book unfold, the book of Judges. Not only do we see this influence Israel, but even Israel's judges start behaving like the nations around them. So Judges 1 walks through this in great detail, this problem that Canaan is not fully driven out. So it says things like Judah was unable to drive out the people on the plains. The Benjaminites, say that 3 times quickly. did not drive out the Jebusites. Manasseh didn't drive out the Canaanites. And then we go on and we see Ephraim and Zebulun and Asher and Naphtali. And actually it lists 8 of the tribes that don't fully drive out the Canaanites. As a matter of fact, in most cases, not only do they not drive them out, it actually says that Israel made agreements or treaties or covenants with the Canaanites. So they were forcing them into labor, but they had agreements with them, which is one of the things that they were told not to do. So that's all happening in chapter 1. And then we get to chapter 2, and we see this kind of declaration from an angel of Yahweh that explains the problem that they found themselves in because of their lack of complete obedience. So, Hannah, could you read verses 1 through 4 in that second chapter?
Now the angel of Yahweh went up from Gilgal to Bochim, I think that's correctly pronounced, and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land, tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. When the angel of Yahweh spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept.
Yeah. I mean, they even end up naming this town the Weepers to remember this moment.
What a name.
Yeah, what a name. But this is exactly what we just said that they were not supposed to do. He says, don't make covenants with this, the people of this land. And of course, that's what they did. They made treaties and covenants with people of this land. So Yahweh had continually warned them about compromise. Things go really badly for Israel. Within the next few verses, by Judges chapter 2, verse 15, the Bible just simply says they were in great distress. This is where the cycle of judges is introduced. These leaders that would come and try to rescue them from themselves. So let's pick it up in verse 16 and read to verse 19, if we could, Hannah.
Then Yahweh raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of Yahweh. They did not follow their example. Whenever Yahweh raised up judges for them, Yahweh was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For Yahweh would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways.
What an indictment, right? So there's a lot of important things happening in this passage. Yahweh hears his people cry out, and he's compassionate, and he's gracious, and he intervenes. And he raises up leaders among them to solve their problem. Now, as I said, in many of the cases, we actually read this same repeated line, the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him. This was true of many of their judges, Othniel, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. Even the judges that we'll talk about in a little bit that were really bad judges. You still see God like, okay, if this is the best I've got to work with, then I will work. And this shows what Yahweh said to them is he would not break covenant with them. Yahweh's committed to stand by them. And so he was with the judge. He delivers the Israelites over and over and over again. But when the judge would die, they would relapse and their behavior got progressively worse. So I think it's important to remember all of this goes back to not ridding Canaan of the inhabitants that were worshiping other gods. So this cycle actually works at 2 levels. There's this first immediate level where they'd find themselves completely in trouble. A foreign king would take some sort of a town or conquer them, or something would happen. They would cry out. God would raise up a judge. They would get delivered. The judge dies. So there's that cycle, the cycle of the lifetime of that judge. But what happens in the book of Judges is there's a much larger cycle at play, because each time they return less and less and less to the life, to the ethic, to the morality, to the faithfulness that they were called to. And so we see this constant progression towards more and more just like the world, just like the world, just like the world. And this goes on for over 300 years. So from the time of Joshua until we see the end of this book, things get really, really dismal.
Hmm. Yeah, for anyone that reads the book of Judges, I think you'll quickly see that cycle. I know for me, I remember drawing in my journal when I was reading the book of Judges a cycle, and would plot all the times like, oh, and it happened again. And as you've said, it's that being led astray by the gods of surrounding nations, then abandoning God, things not going well for them, so they cry out for his rescue, he intervenes, and then the cycle keeps going. And I think that refrain you mentioned earlier, everyone did what was right in his or their own eyes, that seems like a good summary for the book in many ways. And I think it can be tempting to judge Israel for this cycle and how they keep falling back into it. But I'm aware of how easy it is for us to fall into similar cycles ourselves as individuals and as a collective. So there's a lot I think we can learn from this book. Including, I think for me this time round, I saw a need to emphasize the faithfulness of God. And I think even you just said that his commitment to standing by them, as much as the sinfulness and failure of man that these cycles show. I think it really highlights his commitment to the covenant. So when it comes to spirituality, and I guess I've already touched a little bit on something like a spiritual takeaway, but what do you think we ought to, I guess, take from these stories then when it comes to our kind of spiritual lives?
Yeah, there's a lot of implications here for this. One's interesting that you just brought up. You said there's this cycle that repeats over and over and over again. I think maybe I'll ask you this. I mean, why does this cycle get repeated? What does that tell us about human nature? What does that tell us about God's faithfulness when we see this happen over and over and over and over again? Right?
Was that rhetorical? You're asking me?
No.
Right in the comments.
Maybe you have an answer to that question.
Well, I think it does show that human nature hasn't changed that much, or how quick we are to forget, I think.
Yeah,
and how God never forgets. Thank goodness.
Right. Both are true. I mean, it's within the lifetime of the judge. 40 years go by, then everything goes back. But then they never really fully come back. But to your point, Yahweh is faithful, faithful, faithful. I mean, if you look at this story, you go, why is he still faithful?
Makes me think of
Go ahead.
the definition of love in the New Testament. The first one being love is patient.
Yeah. I mean, we have a bad week and we get insecure. We mess up, we fall into sin, we do something, we go, does God still love me? I mean, part of what's fascinating, and I think why we have to read these stories is we go, okay, when God says he's a faithful covenant partner, he's a faithful covenant partner. There's like nothing redeeming going on here.
Right.
Except that they're crying out for help and they show a little bit of remorse. It's fascinating. So yes, I think it's important to pause and talk about the implications of this. Now, one of the things that we have to talk about is their inability to commit to complete obedience and the implications of that. So Israel did partly obey. They went into the promised land. They drove out some of the Canaanites. They didn't completely obey. And that came back to bite them. So this is a hard teaching to explore in today's world. People want to be able to determine how much spirituality they have, how much commitment they have. And I think it's a hard one to talk about.
I wonder also how many of the Israelites saw themselves not as abandoning God, but just adding in a few other gods from these other nations like adding that worship in addition to worshiping the God of their fathers. But I think it's so important to see that to God this was considered forsaking him. When I think about, Yahweh is an exclusive God, a jealous God, which I think that also doesn't sit well with us today either.
Right.
That
Right.
exclusivity.
Well, and we forget that we're looking at, I mean, we read a couple lines and it's 40 years go by, right? And most of us, if we look at a 40-year span in our life, we can get, okay, how faithful, how committed am I today? And where will I be? We make these little decisions, and it's really all about the long term. But when we don't root out and we don't fully obey, that's where this takes root. And it just takes a little compromise over lots of time for us to really falter. I mean, that's the whole point here. So we have to ask ourselves that question: how much do I really need to live in obedience to God? What level of commitment's really necessary? I mean, a lot of times today, people feel very critical of or they select, right? Maybe I disagree with some of the scriptures. Maybe I don't want to live in complete obedience, but there's some things I really like here. Or, I mean, that whole idea of total commitment to or faithfulness to God is really challenging today. So, this is a real critical aspect of our spirituality. And I think it's one of those spaces where we can even talk about how this plays into the New Testament and our own Christianity. Commitment to Jesus cannot be half hearted. And I think you see that a lot in the New Testament. Whatever we do not rid ourselves of, right? This is the parallel. Where they didn't rid the promised land of Canaan, and those things would influence them. The direct parallel for us is when we do not rid ourselves of our sins, of our behaviors, of those things in us that are of the world, they will continue to plague us.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think I also see God's willingness to partner with us in it, like in the book of Judges, like we're not left alone. I think we've spoken in earlier episodes about God's willingness and even desire to partner with us. And that's something I see clearly here, also in the way that he will not act without our willingness, though. Like he did not eradicate these nations and their gods for them.
Yep.
And it makes me think how often we would wish that God would do the work of spirituality and maturity
Right.
for us. That maybe we say a prayer and a besetting sin is just gone the next day. And I think while he can work miraculously like that, more often we do see a desire in him to partner with us in this work. And because I think our willingness to work alongside him reveals where our heart is and our priorities. And that was the case for the Israelites, for sure.
Yeah. There's a book when I was preparing for this episode that I came across that I really liked by G.K. Beale, and it's called We Become What We Worship. It deals with the heart of idolatry, which is really, really what's at play here, right? This is the great sin. It's idolatry. Now, I think we got to look at idolatry in the big picture way. What idolatry is at its core is something besides Yahweh that's shaping our life. It's something that we are revolving around, that we're thinking like, that's forming us other than Yahweh. And he has this great quote. He says, "What you revere, you resemble, either for ruin or for restoration." So this is where I think we can often misinterpret what idolatry is. I mean, I've heard Christians get really critical of other followers of Jesus because a painting of Jesus, that's an idol, or a statue or an icon. Like, those are the idols that the Bible's warning against. That's not what's destroying people's faith. What's destroying people's faith is living their lives surrounding something, guiding them, that's of the world. So if we use Beale's terminology here, we could say simply, if we revere Jesus truly, we will become like him. If we reveal popularity or an ideology or a political party or capitalism, that will shape us. There's another thing at play here, an idol that is tearing through our culture right now, and it's rampant individualism. Many people today value their own personal expression or their rights or their wounds more than they revere Jesus. And they feel validated and justified, even judging people or whole groups of other people because they see them as rigid, because you're not respecting my personal expression. And I think we have to see that for what it is. When self becomes God or the idol, our life revolves around that ideology. It just goes sideways. And I think that's what Beale is getting at. And that's what the book of Judges is teaching us. So there's a couple verses in the New Testament that really address this idea of getting rid of. So we can look at that parallel again of getting rid of the Canaanites, fully driving them out. And we see that same language. And I think we'll see the parallel with the book of Judges with these two verses here. Hannah, if you could read Colossians 3:5-10.
Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly: sexual morality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient. These are the ways you also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices and have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator.
So I think there's something we have to say here that's really important. This is something that I think we often mistake, which is, what is the reason why Yahweh wanted the Canaanites out of the land? And when they failed, was God just angry and judgmental of Israel? I mean, the heart of it is, I want them out for your benefit. And I think this is sometimes where Christians get messed up with sin. Why does God want these things out of our life? Because if something happens, God's really disappointed in us. Like it's this father who's, up there in heaven judging us. That's not what's happening here. Why are we to rid ourselves of these things? It's for our own benefit. When we don't completely eradicate these things, they just come back to haunt us and bite us and steer us to the wrong places. And it's that constant pull back. And I think that's what's so difficult about this, is if we don't see this properly, that this is out of a heart of covenant, this is because God cares, because he wants us to live a full life, then we can even mess up how we process when we make these mistakes. This kind of goes back to our human limitations conversation, right? Why does God set these limitations? Because he knows it's what's going to hurt you. So
hard to see in the moment sometimes.
It
but
is.
It's in hindsight.
Hard to see in the moment. So that's kind of the first part of the book of Judges. This whole idea, as we said, this first problem, which they didn't rid themselves of the Canaanites. The second part, which we'll kind of move through quicker, is what actually plays out in the rest of the book. So the book of Judges is actually named after this type of leader that Israel had at the time. They were called judges.
Right. And just to confirm, so there are no kings yet in Israel. So judges are kind of, in a way, a precursor to kings.
There are no kings. Yes, there will be kings. As a matter of fact, by the time we get to the end of Judges and Ruth, we're going to really see the need for a different kind of leader. And that's where we will see this entry of kings. So judges were really more regional political military leaders. They were kind of like tribal chieftains. And what we see in the main part of this book in chapters 3-16 are these stories of judges that were coming to power, and that when they were in charge, things got better, and then they'd get progressively worse. And so we even see each judge getting progressively worse. By the time we get to the last 4 chapters of the book of Judges, 17-21, it's terrible. I mean, it's really terrible. So it's kind of like it needs to have like R-rated or even worse. I mean, when you read these stories, because Israel had fallen so far. So I would say we could categorize these judges in 3 general categories. The first ones were pretty good, you know. The
That's the name of the
second,
category.
yeah, that's the category. Pretty good.
Okay.
They did pretty good. The second category, which we'll put Gideon in, he was okay. He started off okay, went really bad at the end. And then by the end, we have these 2 judges, Jephthah and Samson, which were just bad, right? They're just bad judges. So let's just kind of briefly talk about these because there's a lot of interesting characters here. So the first judge we see is Othniel in the first half of the book of Judges, chapter 3. And the quick story that starts just says in Judges 3:7, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, forgetting Yahweh their God and serving the Baals and the Ashereths. So Yahweh raises up and he empowers this judge, Othniel, and they have military victory. And then it just says the land rested for 40 years. So good, short little story. Then we get to the second part of chapter 3. And again, it says in verse 12, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. And Yahweh allows a foreign king to come and take an Israelite city. They cry out, the people cry out to Yahweh, and he raises up a judge. This one's named Ehud, who happens to be a left-handed man. I guess that was important. And he defeated this king who had come to take this Israelite city and subdued Moab. And again, during his lifetime, which was long, for the next 80 years, they had peace.
Okay, so I've always liked Ehud because I'm left-handed.
Oh,
and I feel like often we get a bad rep. And I feel like Ehud, in a way, I know it's quite gory, but he shows the advantage of, at least the military advantage of being left-handed.
Okay. Do you want to tell us what that is?
Well, yeah, I think I was looking at commentary on this. Like, they would normally carry the sword on the right-hand side. So he would have been able to sneak the sword in, and they would have been looking for a right-handed fighter. Correct me if anyone is an expert on this.
Okay.
And that's how he's able to sneak in and kill King Eglon, because he was left-handed.
And King Eglon was a large man.
He was, yeah. He swallowed the sword with his body.
We'll just have to encourage people to go and read that story to see what actually happened because of the man's largeness and the left-handedness of Ehud. So then we get to our third. This is a fascinating one, right? We get to our third judge that's in the pretty good category, and it's a woman, Deborah.
Woo-hoo!
So do you want to read Judges 4:1 and 2 for us?
Yeah. So it says, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh after Ehud died. So Yahweh sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan. The commander of his army was Sisera. Right. And then in Judges 4:4, it says, at that time, Deborah, a prophet, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel.
Right. We have a woman judging Israel, which, I mean, that sounds like that would be a fascinating conversation if we could just sit with that one.
I know, a whole episode.
So she leads Israel to victory against this oppressive Canaanite King Jabin and his commander Sisera. And at her command, Barak, the military commander, gathers an army and they defeat the Canaanite forces. The military commander on the other side, Sisera, flees the battle and he goes to seek refuge in the tent of Jael. Is it Jael? I don't know. Jael. Who kills him by driving a tent peg through his head. Deborah's leadership and her victory are celebrated in this song. Now, we've talked about songs, and there's not a lot of them. I can't remember the number. Is it 15 or so songs that we read in the Old Testament?
I can't remember.
But it's a poetic retelling of the events from this fascinating time.
Yeah, it's a shame we can't do episodes on each of these characters, but I do think it's interesting to get a female judge in a particularly patriarchal society. And she's appointed to lead and guide the people of Israel in matters of righteousness. And she's introduced actually to us as sitting under a palm, and the Israelites would come up to her to judge their situations. And it's actually quite similar to Moses in Exodus. And yeah, so we see that she has this song, again, similar to the Song of Moses, that's in chapter 5. And in that song, she's called a mother in Israel. And I just think she's a fascinating character as this woman that was able to offer her gifts and passion to God for use for his people. And she gained their trust. And clearly Barak and her had this kind of partnership in that way. And so, yeah, it's very interesting, even to see the role, as you said, that song plays too, because I think it's meant to be repeated, like this victory story, both of her kind of victory leadership as well as God's victory, that the Israelites were meant to sing and remember. So, yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, and I remember as a very young Christian hearing a message about Barak, the
Oh,
military
wow.
commander, because
A whole
his
sermon on Barak.
I did, and it was because of his attitude. He's like, I won't go if you won't go. You know, he says to Deborah, I won't go if you won't go. Like, he lacks courage, right?
Oh, I
And
see. Huh.
she reacts by saying, okay, great, I'll do this, but because of your, she didn't say cowardice, but because of your cowardice, the enemy commander Sisera will be delivered into the hand of a woman. And that's where we see
Take that.
Jael, you know, killing him with the tent peg. So it was an all men's
Wow.
class, and it was all about not being, and I won't use the language, but don't be
I
like,
can imagine.
don't be like Barak, who lacked courage. We'll give it, that's the G version of
I love that.
what that class was about.
And
So
Deborah had courage.
she had courage, as did Jael. So those are kind of the you know, these are pretty good judges. Although Israel continued to get worse, and then we get into this kind of middle space where Gideon comes on the scene, and you know, Gideon, Judges 6 to 9, we have a couple chapters here devoted to his story, and he starts off pretty well. He lacks courage and he lacks faith, but God uses him regardless of all that. Then he ends up murdering some of his own Israelite brothers, and then he sets up an idol and leads Israel astray. So, you know, okay is generous, right? To call him okay as a judge is generous. But then we get to these two really depraved, or depraved, actually, depraved judges, Jephthah in Judges 10 through 12, and then Samson in chapters 13 to 16. What's really sad about Jephthah is, you know, it says the Spirit of the Lord came on him, he delivers victory. But what we see him do is put into practice the very thing that Yahweh was concerned about, this child sacrifice that the Canaanites would practice. And here he offers his own daughter in sacrifice for this victory, which, you know, again, I mean, the implication is just, this is how far Israel has fallen. Their leaders are doing the same things that the Canaanite leaders would do. By the time we get to Samson, you know, this man is very unspiritual, very immoral. He's violent, he's angry. And even with all that, because of Yahweh's compassion and grace, he imparts his spirit and delivers some victories, even with this, you know, terrible leader in Samson. So, you know, by the time we get to the end of the story, you just see this falling trajectory. And as I said before, the end of these last 4 chapters are very disturbing. Israel's completely fallen from all that Yahweh had hoped for them. And ultimately, what this book points out is Israel's need for constant grace, their ability to only stand because of the covenant that Yahweh is honoring and Yahweh's intervention. And so by the time we get to the very end in Judges 21-25, it just says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes.
Hmm. It's funny, as you're going through that, I'm just like marveling at the fact that they're listed in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. We have Gideon there, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. So don't know what to make of that, but we'll get there when we get there in the New Testament.
Well, I mean, but okay, but think about that. I mean, that is Yahweh's grace.
Yeah, seriously.
Think about the grace. I mean, if you just come with me a little, if you just let me work through you a little, we just sometimes we get this idea in our head that we've got to be these spiritual giants. And to me, one of the beautiful things about them being listed in that is how far Yahweh will go to work with us in all of our weakness and dysfunction. It's amazing, right?
Well, thank you for that overview of the judges. I love those categories, so everyone can make note of that. We have the pretty good, the okay, and the bad.
Yeah, I do have to confess, I got those from the Bible Project. They do a great job, which I would encourage people, if they want to know the Bible, if they want to know more about this, that's a really great place to start. They do a great overview. So I think and I think it's important that as we kind of land this, we talk about processing that piece of this, which Yahweh intercedes when Israel gets in trouble because he's gracious and compassionate. He will work with whatever he has to work with, but he will not override the process of co-regency with his people. And I mean, if you think about why were these leaders so bad? Because the culture was producing bad leaders, and God worked with what he had to work with. So even though they had temporary victories, without full repentance, this victory wouldn't last. They had to have a different kind of leadership. And this is where this is all leading us, right? They needed a leader who would not just be political and military leader, but a spiritual leader. They needed someone who would model a faithful and spiritual life. So I think it kind of sets us up for where this has to go.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to conclude, is that we are left now with the need for something very different, a different kind of leader. And in many ways, this book and the book of Ruth, which we'll look at next week, kind of cue up the need for this leader. And Judges shows us how much of a spiritual void there really is in Israel at this time. And next week, we're going to be looking at the book of Ruth, which will lay the groundwork for the genealogy of David, who is to come. And of course, we know that's the line of the Messiah. And we'll have a guest next week, our friend Cherie.
Yay.
So, Cherie Gale.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. That'll be great. Have Cherie with us. So good conversation, Hannah, as always. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you, Dave, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next week.
Time. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I